You're listening to Money FM 89.3, and it's now time for Under the Radar with me, Chua Tian Tian. Now, did you know that Singapore has been home to many foreign banks in the 1800s? Well, in fact, our guest for today is one of them. Having opened its first branch in Singapore back in 1877, HSBC Singapore is a qualifying full bank serving the international needs of individual, corporate, and institutional clients. It provides retail banking, wealth management, commercial investment, private banking, insurance, as well as securities and capital market services. Fast forward to today, HSBC Singapore has close to 4,000 employees and serves as an international wealth and regional wholesale hub, while being a sandbox for digital innovation experiments for the group. Now, the bank is now carving out a bigger role for Singapore as a regional hub as it expands in Asia, with the city receiving funds from a $6 billion investment earmarked to drive its Asian growth between 2021 and 2026. But really, what can we expect on this front? Well, for more, let's speak to Kiju Wong, CEO of HSBC Singapore. He is also the first Singaporean CEO of HSBC Singapore. Kiju, welcome to the show.
Tian Tian, thank you for that wonderful introduction, to the bank and to our history in Singapore. And to myself, it's a real privilege to be on your talk show today.
Great to have you on board as well. And we've briefly talked about how HSBC is actually one of the first foreign banks to set foot in Singapore. But we really want to hear from you, Kiju. How would you define HSBC's value proposition, business model, and how does HSBC Singapore fit in the bigger scheme of things?
Tian Tian, I think that's a great starting question. If I just take a look back into when the bank was established in Singapore in 1877 and our purpose here, I think that purpose really then drives our value proposition for our clients, right? And maybe just to streamline it, our value proposition is really to help our customers capture international opportunities. When we were here in 1877 and really at Collier Key was really to help the traders, with their financing, with credit facilities, right? Singapore's an entrepreneur center at that point of time and a gateway between the East and the West, right, for many traders. You fast forward to today, Singapore continues to play a very important role. And conceivably, one would say that Singapore today, given the different geopolitical challenges that have occurred recently, Singapore now has become really very much a gateway into ASEAN, where many corporates are using Singapore, as a hub, right, to undertake their business. I mean, if we look at the amount of funds flows and FDI that has come into, ASEAN, ASEAN is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. GDP to set to exceed 4 trillion by 2025. FDI in the ASEAN in 2021 reached about 174 billion US dollars, which is 11% of global FDI, second only to China's 12%. Out of this 174 billion that comes into ASEAN, Singapore actually captures 57% of that flow. So clearly, Singapore is becoming an increasingly important hub for many of our customers to invest to and use it as a center, right, to reach out, across the region. So as an international and a leading international bank in Singapore, it's a huge opportunity for us to lend our regional global expertise and connectivity to these clients as they look for business opportunities across the region and as they look to invest their personal wealth in Singapore and using Singapore as a bridge also, right, to capture opportunities, across the region. So just going back to this value proposition really is to help our customers capture the domestic and international opportunities that, are abounding.
Mm. And maybe, Kiju, who would you then describe as your customers? Are we looking at mainly high net worth individuals, businesses, or retail customers? And also, what is your positioning against the likes of other major banks, be it the trio of local banks or the likes of, Maybank, Stanchart, Hong Leong, as far as Singapore is concerned?
Well, Tian, our positioning very much, if you look at where we are today as an organization and as a bank, we're a universal bank, meaning that we provide banking services from consumers to SMEs to large multinationals, large local corporates, and even institutional clients. So I'd say that our client range, is broad, ranging. However, when I look at the specific segments within that range, I would say maybe we talk first around the consumer base. It would be the mass affluent, high net worth, ultra high net worth clients. Again, right, who have not just a domestic requirement, but really one, where there is an international element, within their needs, whether they're coming into Singapore from an offshore site of if they are Singaporean and looking then to look at investment opportunities or wealth preservation opportunities, not just in Singapore, right, but cross border, because it's really the strength of HSBC in Singapore, right? It's really using our international network to help our clients, get these opportunities. Now, from a commercial perspective, we bank a lot of this SMEs in Singapore to get the large companies, but the customer profile will be one where the client has an international component of their aspiration, and it's not just purely domestic. And that really goes back to my point, right, that we need to play to our strengths, and that's how we position ourselves, right, against the competition in the market. We are one of ASEAN's leading international banks, so wherever you are in Singapore and ASEAN, we can lead you to the US, to Europe, to Middle East, right? And it's not just constrained within this region itself. I think that's really an area of competitive advantage for us.
Mhm. And Kiju, let's take a look at a wider business environment that HSBC lies in right now. You guys reported in May that HSBC has tripled its profits in the first quarter as rising interest rates boosted income. And that number, I believe, your latest figures beat analysts' forecast and helped the bank pay its first quarterly dividend since 2019. So, what is the situation like in Singapore? And also, what is the outlook ahead looking at the banking turmoil and perhaps chances of the rate hike cycle coming to an end in the US? How does it weigh on net interest margins, though?
When I look at, the profitability in Singapore has been very much, driven by many different component parts, and it's not just net interest margins that have driven this. So if I just look at our year-on-year growth from 21 to 22, we had almost 64% growth in our PBT, which is an amazing amount. And, it's driven by many component parts. And I would say too, right, more customers doing more with us, recognizing the value it can bring to them from consumer banking perspective, our mass affluent high net worth clients, right, we grew at about 23%. They brought in over 53% of new AUMs, right? On the wholesale side, our customer segments, growth was around 41%. So you can see it's not just, I mean, it is customer growth, right? And also supplemented by the tailwinds brought in by improved, margins coming in from the rate hikes. Now, if I take a look forward, and I would say that the rate hike cycle, one would considerably say that it's probably reached its peak or it's tapering, and maybe the one or two more to go. But look and probably focus a lot more on the value that we can bring to our customers. And I'll say that as more customers, undertake to do business with us, because of our strength, because of our international connectivity, because of our people, the platform solutions that we bring to place, I would still be very optimistic, as we look forward. Yes, I think as we go into the second quarter or the second half of the year, things look to be a lot more muted. But as my customers, right, when I talk to them, their views of that sort of crisis. In every crisis, right, there's an opportunity. So if you look at the Chinese word for crisis, right, it's wei qi, right? So there's danger, but in wei xian the way, but then there's also opportunity in ji hui, right? So I think that's where our customers are looking at and capturing opportunities, not just in Singapore but across the region. They're looking, at areas where they can better support supply chains across the ASEAN region, connecting to China, connecting to the Middle East, looking for asset purchase, opportunities. Because in this situation, there will always be opportunities where one just needs to have the courage, right, to look into and to capture.
Mm. And I do want to talk about the trends right now and the banking industry. I mean, let's start with fund flows. I believe that HSBC used to derive most of its Asia revenues from Hong Kong, but this has changed in recent days. In fact, you were talking about ASEAN and how it saw this foreign direct investments of 11% of total world flows. So, how does that influence the way in which you position or you take HSBC Singapore forward as CEO?
No, when I just look at the profitability of the bank as a group, right, Hong Kong still plays a huge contributing role in terms of the profitability. But I would say that, the other regions where we're now focused on, other countries that we're now focused on, are contributing a lot more because of the focus that we have also been, undertaking as a group. From a group strategy perspective, there has been a huge pivot, right, to Asia. Right. So when we say pivot to Asia, it's not just about Hong Kong and China, but we're also looking at Singapore and India specifically for investments. But let me just maybe go back to the first question that you posed, and what is the latest or number one trend in industry? I say the number one trend we cannot ignore, right? It's really climate change. This is we all know is an existential threat that the world and the countries around face, right? Especially for us in Asia. When we look in Asia, right, I think the net zero challenge is especially acute given that it's home to about five of the 10 largest emitters in the world. About 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the region due to a large and growing population. So this transition to a low carbon economy is extremely complex and requires huge levels of investment. We know that the climate crisis can only be tackled through collaboration between public and private sectors, but I think the banking industry plays a leading role, right, in this, change and transition because we need to be able to finance that change. So from a HSBC perspective, we are looking at this in three ways, right? Number one, using our global network scale and influence to advocate for systematic action. Number two, working with governments, banks, and other global institutions to ensure investments can be swiftly channeled towards sustainable projects. I think three, right, through our partnerships, you're playing a role in developing the technologies needed to take the world, right, really to net zero. I think specifically for Singapore, if you look at some of the earlier works which were started when I arrived in Singapore, the setup of Pentagreen, Capital, right, where we launched in partnership with Temasek. It's a debt financing platform dedicated to financing marginally bankable, sustainable infrastructure projects, right, across Southeast Asia.
And I do want to circle back on two countries that you mentioned earlier. One is Singapore, the other is India. What are the opportunities specifically for these two geographical markets? Any segments that you're targeting for now?
I think for Singapore, maybe I'll focus on Singapore, right? When we look at the investments, coming into Singapore, and I think we've publicly stated that we're putting about 6 billion, right, to Asia, about 3 billion, of capital investments, right, will come into, Southeast Asia, right, specifically Singapore and India. From a Singapore lens, I think the opportunities are immense, and we started off really, reflected by the acquisition of AXA Insurance, which we have now successfully integrated into HSBC Life, and that's really part of our focus on the wealth and developing a wealth and health, proposition in Singapore and catering to the needs of our clients, right, within the segments, right. So I think that Pentagreen Capital is another example where we put in capital. But apart from these bolt-on acquisitions, I would say we're also investing heavily into putting regional resource right into Singapore. See the regional heads of South and Southeast Asia for commercial banking business now reside in Singapore. We just announced too, right, the regional head for our South and Southeast Asia business for consumer banking also now reside in Singapore. So you're seeing a increased number of important decision makers, right, responsible for the South and Southeast Asia, right, coming to Singapore as part of investments. We're also developing and piloting a lot of new technology platforms, in Singapore itself, and really working hand in hand also with the MES industry transformation roadmap and the areas of focus. So these are areas where I think a lot of the investments will come into play. And we play an important corridor too with our India counterparts, because if you look at India today, India is a fantastic growth opportunity, it's a fantastic growth story. So how do we connect our customers in Singapore to the opportunities that are residing in India and vice versa?
And let's talk a little bit about Singapore. I know you mentioned about how Singapore is receiving funds from a 6 billion US dollar or 8.1 billion Sing dollar investment to drive your Asian growth between 2021 and 2026. You mentioned about a couple of deals like that 529 million US dollar acquisition of AXA Insurance last year, the 150 million US dollar Pentagreen Capital joint venture with Temasek back in 2021. But looking ahead, what is in your pipeline right now?
I think that our pipeline is really to continue to focus on ensuring that the teams have the ability to commercialize a lot of the investments we put into place, right? So it's not just about continually doing and putting on new add-ons, but organically growing too, right? By ensuring that we got the best tech platforms to service our customers. We focus on what's important, right, from our customers' lens, and that is around the areas of sustainability and climate change. How can we continue to focus to support them as they transition, right, to net zero, as they move their business models and use digitization to help them to be more efficient. Now, but it's not just about efficiency, right? It's also around how they can transform themselves, into a more carbon neutral, environment, and develop a better business model, right, to support them. So it's really around the focus of people, right? Focus on the platforms that will enable us to add value to our clients, and then push forward and ensure that we are able to then fully utilize the investments we've put in place through Pentagreen Capital, through HSBC Life, our new insurance entity in Singapore. But we'll continue to innovate, right, in Singapore, and that's something that we are doing quite a fair bit on the digital, platforms that come into place. We're really excited to make some new announcements that will come into place at the Singapore FinTech Festival. So stay tuned for that. But again, right, huge focus on how the digital solutions can help our customers with international needs, right, as they move into and out of Singapore.
Well, giving us a piece of juicy teaser and keeping us excited here. Well, if you're just tuning in, we are now speaking to Kiju Wong, CEO of HSBC Singapore. And meanwhile, Kiju, just want to get your thoughts on this. HSBC also unveiled a new HSBC Innovation Banking Unit. I believe that's globally, and that's carved out from that UK subsidiary of Silicon Valley Bank. Now, to what extent will a foray into the VC or startup scene in the UK trickle down to Singapore, though?
I think our HSBC Innovation Banking Unit is an exciting new development for the bank, and it's really a network of specialist expertise and capabilities focused on the innovation economy, right? Just under one distinct brand. So I do believe that as it's still in a nascent stage in terms of the integration and bring them in, but we're so excited because we believe that there are a lot of new and innovative, solutions, right, that we can bring from a VC, perspective into the fintech space, and into the investments in that area. A lot of the learnings we envision will trickle down into Asia, especially in Hong Kong and then into Singapore, and that will allow us, right, to utilize the solutions to really help, support a more vibrant, right, fintech ecosystem in Singapore. And that's a huge area where the Singapore government, a lot of the fintech community are looking forward to. It also fits perfectly into our commercial banking, business model in Singapore, right? As these companies become bigger, they then become our commercial banking clients, and we are then able to help them evolve and help them grow along that journey, right? Apart from just being a domestic fintech, how can we help them grow bigger, become regional, become global? And those are our aspirations and ambitions.
And don't mind me for trying to piece things together, Akiju. You talked about at the Singapore FinTech Festival, we can expect something. And has that got to do with the VC or startup funding, given how Singapore is a sandbox for digital innovation experiments for the group?
Well, Tian Tian, I can only say stay tuned for some of this exciting news that we hope to bring.
Well, okay, let's wrap up the conversation, Kiju, by talking a little bit more about yourself. I believe and I understand you are the first Singaporean CEO of HSBC Singapore. And back then, it was 144 years in the country when you first took on the role. So tell us more about your leadership journey, and also how would you make strategic decisions differently from your predecessors given your understanding of local markets?
Well, I think I guess career journey was one that was very interesting. I mean, I started off basically in Singapore. I mean, I studied here. I did my NS in Singapore. I did my schooling, and I went to NUS. Did not have an opportunity to study overseas, right? So never had any overseas experience. But when I first started working, I thought that, look, if the opportunity will come up, it'd be great for me to go and explore the world, right? Because there are probably many different shades of gray, and one would say that in Singapore it could possibly be black or white, right? It's both ways. So I think that international experience, has given me a lot of insight, right, into different cultures, into different ways of working, and to think maybe a bit more creatively in terms of how we can address problems, because you go through different challenges, right, across the world. So I think coming back to Singapore, that's really shaped me on my own career journey and given me a lot of ability to think maybe a bit differently, to take action a bit more creatively and with a bit more with a different lens. And I think that's important, right, for Singapore, because Singapore is an international financial center. I think all of us here recognize that. So having that ability, then coming back to Singapore and understanding local culture too, understanding how business is done, but then utilizing the international platform that I had the privilege, right, to get on, to really lend even more advice to my clients, right? And to have a better ability to have a more informed dialogue, right, with our clients. So, for example, I think a lot of our clients are still very interested in China. I spent almost 10 years in China. So, coming back, that's given me a great ability to have a dialogue with my clients about China, about opportunities, about observations, about how to do business in those areas, right? But it's also given me opportunity, and I was recently in China to let my Chinese clients know what they can do in Singapore or out of Singapore, whether it's on a business perspective where they set up the regional or global treasury centers here or finance centers, or even for their personal wealth, how they can invest into Singapore, how they can use their personal wealth to help, from a blended finance perspective or philanthropy perspective into what our aspirations are on the ESG front. So I think that that's hugely exciting. I think using this experience too has also encouraged me to speak to a lot of our local Singaporeans here, right, and try to get them, with a thought process about moving offshore, about thinking about, how they can broaden and widen their own experience, right, using my own career story as an example.
And I suppose that will also have an impact on how you train locals to take up leadership positions within HSBC.
Yes, I think we can train locals, in Singapore, but at the same time to always encourage them to go, and explore, a different area, right? I think geographically outside of Singapore, I'm not telling them that you need to go for 22 years like what I've done, but at least spend a period of time, understand the culture, understand how business is done, right? I think when you come back, you can add more value to your clients. And this is also a reflection of some other Singaporeans who have worked overseas and have come back to Singapore, right? They find that they have a better ability to have a more informed dialogue, with clients. So today itself, HSBC's got probably about 190
Wow.
Singaporeans working across the globe, right? And we just created also now what we call a Singapore Global, Connections Network to ensure that we link up. They can be our Singapore ambassadors for people wanting to work in that country, or be an ambassador for people in that country wanting to come and work in Singapore. So I think it creates a more vibrant, ecosystem. It creates a more vibrant dialogue, and people get, more information, and they grow in their careers, right, as they move along.
Hmm. And before we let you go very quickly, Kiju, what are some of your priorities for HSBC Singapore for the second half of this year? What can we expect?
I think for second half of this year, continued growth, right? Continued aspirations to lead this organization in our pillars of focus, which will be again sustainability, will be on digitization. A lot of focus also on our people development, right? I think the second half of the year it's going to be from an environmental perspective a bit more choppy. Talking to many of my clients, and the focus is really to help them navigate the environment that's out there, not just in Singapore but across the region and globally, help them identify and capture opportunities, right? And in that process, help them grow. And I'm especially focused on ensuring that for Singapore corporates, it's important to get them offshore. It's important to get them, to grow much bigger than just, in Singapore, because the market is saturated, the market is much smaller. So how can we help them connect to opportunities in China, right? In India, right? Even in Malaysia and across the ASEAN, region, because we're one of the few banks that continue to have a huge global presence in many countries, and we need to ensure that we're leveraging that presence to help our customers to do business.
Thanks a lot, Kiju. That was Kiju Wong, CEO of HSBC Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us on Money FM 89.3. You can also tune into an extended version of this conversation on audio, Apple Podcast, and Spotify.
Money FM 89.3.